Awesome. So my watch says 11, so I'm going to get started. First of all, thank you everyone so much for coming. Genuinely heartfelt. There's some friendly faces I know in the audience. First time for me doing anything like this, so hopefully not too nervous, but I'll muddle my way through worst case. Again, welcome. Today we're here to talk about possibility space and designing compelling choices. So first things first, who am I? Hi to anyone who hasn't met me. My name's Lachlan, or you might know me as Tutti. I'm a local designer here in Melbourne at Playside Studios, and I've been working professionally in games now for about 6 years. If you want to talk to me after this about anything games related, if you want to show me pictures of your cat or talk about local gigs or anything, feel free to come and find me. I'll be at the Designer Network Hour after this. Yeah, here are some of the great games that I've had the pleasure to work on during my career so far. Some of these games we'll be referencing in little case studies throughout the talk today. That includes Dumb Ways to Survive, which was the winner in the Excellence in Mobile during last year's AGDAs, and then Dumb Ways Free For All has been nominated for this year's Excellence in the VR category. So if you do want to see any more of my work, feel free to check out my portfolio over at heyitstutti.com. So today's talk, as mentioned, we're going to be discussing the concept of possibility space, how we can use it as designers as a useful lens to analyze the choices that our players are making within our games. How to make players feel like they're making informed decisions, how to give them the information they need to make what you deem as the designer as the correct decisions. How you can pace your mechanics and your clarity of rules so that players don't become overwhelmed by too many options or too many choices. And of course, how to provide meaningful outcomes, how to make sure that the choices that those players are making feel acknowledged. And finally, we'll just run through some little psychological tips and tricks, some things you can use as a designer to kind of reframe those choices and how people consider them. So, first things first, what is possibility space? Simply put, possibility space is the range of decisions that can be made during a given moment of play. So the example on the right here is from the game Brink. And it simply depicts, in this moment of play, what are the choices that the player can make to get up this ledge. So why is this even useful? I think when you hear that the talk is about sort of compelling choices, you might be someone that's inclined to immediately jump to kind of narrative games where the choices you make have sort of big, impactful repercussions on the game's story, and that is absolutely part of it. Otherwise, you might be a designer that's like me, that sort of gets a little bit lost in your systems, in the minutiae of sort of looking at your core loop and analyzing and reanalyzing the balancing and impact of those systems. What possibility space does is it allows us to take a step back and to kind of look at that human connection as the point to the game, and again, discuss, what kind of choices are our players making? Does it line up with the choices you expect? Does it line up with what you want? I think this is useful at all stages of development. If you're in the initial concepting phase and you're looking at sort of your target market, what's your player personas, what kind of audience are you trying to attract? Of course, you can consider what kind of games do they play, what choices do they like to make, and how are you maybe going to tweak that for what your game is. During active development, of course, and especially user testing, I'm going to reference user testing a few times throughout the talk today. I'm a really big advocate for user testing frequently. When you're literally putting the controller in someone's hands and looking at the choices they make, that is the perfect opportunity to be like, is that the choice you want? And why are they making that choice? And then, of course, we're all designers in the year 2025. You can update your games. You can look at live ops data analysis. You can look at the choices people make more often. And again, question, is that the choice I expect? Is there something there that maybe I didn't expect as a designer, something I can lean into? So we'll run through an example really quickly. Here we have a really simple 3x3 grid, noughts and crosses, right? If you're to analyze the possibility space of a game of noughts and crosses, it can be really simple to say, okay, well, there are 9 possible decisions, then 8, 7, etc. Where do I mark my symbol next as the choice that the player is making? But if you take a step back, you need to consider what is influencing that choice in the first place. Are they trying for 3 in a row? Are they trying to block their opponent? Are they trying to do both? That, of course, impacts the decision. But we've started in the middle of the game. Are they playing as noughts and crosses? That was a decision they had to make. And how did they decide who went first? Did they flip a coin? If they chose to flip a coin, did they choose to go heads or tails? Or did they choose to play rock, paper, scissors? And if they did Did they choose rock, paper? I want to emphasize here that when you use this lens of possibility space, you can really blow out even something as simple as noughts and crosses into a series of so many decisions. And I think that's really important to analyze. In fact, if you want to go maybe too far, I would suggest that the very first decision your players make is when they look at your marketing materials and they choose to purchase or download your game. That is the very first decision in your game's possibility space. So, don't take my word for it. Here are some much more prolific, much more famous designers than I ever hoped to be, who use exactly this approach when they develop their games. Will Wright of The Sims fame famously said, there are all these branches in possibility space, and you want that space to be interesting and varied. And Sid Meier of Civilization has a really great GDC talk on exactly this topic, if you haven't already seen it. And he's famously quoted as saying, games are a series of interesting decisions. Now, when I included this slide, it was mostly to add a bit of credibility to the talk topic, but hopefully you've picked up on a consistency that I picked up when I included these quotes, and that's, of course, the word interesting. You know, what makes a choice or any decision in your game interesting? Let's take the example from before and blow the grid up to something that is probably a little bit more recognizable to everyone here. Some of you can probably already see where I'm going with this. Of course, I'm talking about one of the most famous games in the world, big noughts and crosses. No, I'm of course talking about chess, and I think it's not a controversial statement, hopefully, for me to say chess involves much more interesting decisions than a game of big noughts and crosses. It sounds pretty obvious when I say it out loud, right? But why? You know, that's what we're here to discuss today. How do we, as designers, develop compelling choices for our players? First thing, part two, your player needs to be informed, right? They need to know what it is they can possibly choose. Players won't feel like they're making the best decisions if they don't have the information they need to make those choices. You know, the emphasis here is on the word feel, because I think you might be able to see that players may still make what you deem the right decisions, but if they don't know why they're making that choice or they don't feel confident in that, you know, it's not going to feel great to them. I think 90s point-and-click adventure games are notorious for this, right? You sort of press every item and every interaction on everything in the environment until you kind of stumble upon the right solution. You don't have the information you need to make the right choice. In I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream here, the character in this section is afraid of the color yellow and therefore can't go into the next room. Of course, the solution to this puzzle was to pick up a yellow bandana and wrap it across her eyes. As a player, when I played this, I was incredibly frustrated. I thought the game had given me the information I need. She's afraid of yellow, and then it kind of went back on that expectation. You know, I didn't know that this was even a possible choice, so I was frustrated to learn that was the solution they expected. So, one way that you can overcome providing this information players need is, of course, just to teach them the consequences of those choices in a non-punishing environment first. Importantly, you can still punish people here. It's just that you shouldn't punish them too much while they're learning. So if we look at Half-Life 2 as a classic example, the flammable barrels right at the start of the game. They are bright red, they have a flammable symbol on them. It should be pretty obvious. When you approach them for the first time, this barrel actually starts rolling. You've immediately taught the player, oh, these are like affected by physics. I can interact with physics with these as well. When you shoot them a second time, it begins to catch fire, and you can hopefully see at that point that something is up, that something is going to happen. But importantly, if you do somehow manage to blow up and kill yourself in this moment, the checkpoint is only 30 seconds back right at the start of the chapter. They've punished you for making the incorrect choice, but they haven't punished you too much. So in the span of, what, a 3-second GIF, 4-second GIF, it's taught you exactly how to expect to make choices around these flammable barrels when you see them later in the game. Importantly, the player no longer blames the game if they make a mistake and they blow up on these barrels. They blame themselves because the game gave them what they needed to make the correct choice. So when we developed Dumb Ways to Survive, which if you haven't played it is kind of like a cozy survival adventure game for a casual audience, we did exactly this, right? We knew we were approaching it as a casual game. So our fabulous level designer, who's in the audience here, you know, made it very purposefully so when you first leave the campsite, roughly when it hits nighttime for the first time, which is when more aggressive creatures come out, that you're only a stone's throw from the safety of your initial starting campsite. Again, this puts the onus on the player in this moment. They have this expectation now, okay, there are aggressive enemies, but it becomes their choice whether they want to try to fight those enemies or go back to the safety of their campsite and sleep through the night to the next morning. Again, if they do die here, it's only a short walk to go and get the items that they dropped, and they don't blame the game if they make that mistake. Now, if a choice feels obvious to your player, they're going to blame the game if they realize that's impossible. I think we've probably all played a game, right, where you walk up to a door, you press the interact button, nothing happens, right? And you suddenly go, oh, that's not actually something I can interact with. That's a small moment, but those moments can compound really quickly into almost like sort of a je ne sais quoi of frustration. Like you might not be able to put your finger on why the game is frustrating you, but it might be because you have these expectations that aren't being met. When I played Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, in the very first level of the game, climbed to the top of this ridge, saw this cool hippopotamus dinosaur creature, and I had the expectation that, cool, I'd be able to come back to this at some point in the game and fight this awesome optional boss encounter when I had some abilities to get over this gap. So I tried exactly that. I came back with the double jump, with the wall run, with the climbing ability. In fact, the wall run section just below where that creature is has a mural of exactly the creature I'm trying to fight on it. I did this for about 20 minutes before I looked it up, found a Reddit thread of people complaining about exactly the same thing. It's not a boss encounter, it's just a background detail in the stage. And as a player, I felt cheated. I felt like the game had asked me to remember this moment, make this choice to come back here, and then I had just wasted my own time by not having my expectations of the choices I can make met. So one solution for overcoming this kind of impossible choice dichotomy is, lies in your UX and your visual consistency. If you stick with a really clear, structured visual language across your whole game, players will begin to learn what is and isn't a possible choice they can make in that possibility space. So if we take Tears of the Kingdom here, if you haven't played it, this game has sort of a mechanic where you use a magic hand, you can pick up items. They are really consistent with visualizing what you can and can't interact with. Hopefully looking at this screenshot, you can see just at a glance, sort of the middle items there are tied down by a heavy tarp. Then you've got some maybe like barrels and sticks and things that are really dark in color and don't kind of pop out from the environment. Conversely, you've got some really simple shape language with the boxes and things there, and they're much brighter in color. Just glancing at this, hopefully you can tell what is a possible choice in this moment. And if I, activate the ability, hopefully it was pretty clear what the possible choices were. If it wasn't clear, again, by sticking to this consistently, players will begin at least to learn what is a possible choice they can make. We had to solve almost exactly this same issue when we developed Dumbways Free-for-All, which, if you haven't played it, is kind of like a VR party minigame collection. When user testing the game, due to the kind of immersive nature of VR, we found that we got a lot of similar feedback from people saying, hey, this game was fun, this minigame, but I wish I could pick up the bucket in this level, or I wish I could pick up the fishing rod. The items that were never intended to be interactive in the first place. They weren't intended to be choices the player could make. We read between the lines of that feedback, of course. People weren't actually saying that they wanted to do this. They were saying, hey, it's frustrating that I try and I can't. It's not clear to me what is a choice I can make. So we added a really simple fix. We added this kind of golden sheen material that you can see there. And funnily enough, the moment we added this simple material change, that kind of feedback of people not knowing what they can and can't choose drastically reduced. Sometimes people would still try to pick up the wrong thing, but again, I've kind of mentioned this a few times, they stopped blaming the game and blamed themselves. Oh, silly me, that's not golden. Of course I can't pick it up. And they move on, rather than saying it's something they expected to do. So I think it's probably likely that everyone in this room is developing a game that kind of exists within an established genre. If you're making something cool and weird that I've never expected, please talk to me after. I want to hear about that. But I think it's important to note that that is not detrimental, right? We can look at the wealth of knowledge of existing games that players can expect, again, so they know what choices they can make. Don't reinvent tropes for the sake of it. Right? It's more important that your players know what they can do and what they can choose. If you're making a platformer game, people are probably going to expect that A is your jump button. That's a choice that they've learned from other games, And that's amazing. You don't need to teach them that because they've in fact already learned it from previous games. You can push those boundaries of convention later, but focus on what people know so they know what they're doing first. Now, maybe you've made this really good call loop, it's right for your target audience, you've informed people about the choices they can make, or you feel like you have, you put the controller in their hand and you watch them play, they still make the wrong choice. We've all been there, it happens. In these moments, it's really tempting to lean on the written word and literally spell out in a text tutorial like, oh, this is the option you should be choosing, or this is what you should do. And that is absolutely a valid solution. I'm not getting up here to say that it's not. But we know this as a room full of designers, that the problem with this is that players don't like to read. And in fact, if you add too many text tutorial pop-ups that are kind of forced on players, you're just going to decimate your pacing and slow things down and bog down the experience. So as a kind of a general rule of thumb, I like to approach developing this as, text is always the last resort, the optional way to tell someone what to do. I've been playing Donkey Kong Bonanza recently, and as someone working full-time, I only get to play this game maybe once a week. I like that this game respects my intelligence as a player with these optional NPCs with an exclamation mark that I can choose to opt in so it can tell me where to go next. If I, played the game a bit longer, bashed my head against the level design, I'm sure it would tell me exactly what my options are and where I need to go. But again, it's not undermining my intelligence. I am choosing to opt into this as a shortcut to learn what I should be doing next. Awesome. So, you've informed your players of the decisions. How many decisions do they have to make? How do you avoid decision paralysis? You might be familiar with this concept as sort of the paradox of choice. In the year 2000, psychologists Sheena Lienger and Mark Lepper from the Columbia and Stanford universities did this study where they presented two stalls of jams, one with 6 jams for sale and one with 24. What they found was that while people were more likely to approach the stall of 24 jams, they were in fact 10 times less likely to make a purchase at all. Even more, from the people that did make a purchase from this stall of 24 jams, they overall rated their satisfaction in that decision much lower because they potentially regretted their choice. They had 23 other options they missed out on. They regretted that. And what we can glean from this is that too many options actually increases this cognitive fatigue, this psychological load in making that decision, and actually makes it so you're less likely to make a decision at all. This, of course, absolutely maps to games, right? It can be tempting to give your players sort of a ton of options so they can craft the perfect experience for them. However, that level of decision-making can really be off-putting to certain audiences or players that might be new to your game. I booted up Aliens Dark Descent, and I was met with this really detailed difficulty screen. And I think, on paper, as a designer, I love the idea, right, that all of these things you can tweak and I can customize this experience to what I wanted it to be. But I didn't know what genre this game was. I downloaded it off Game Pass because I like the Aliens movies. I was met with this screen and I was immediately turned off. It was too much cognitive load for me. I didn't know what half of these terms meant without the context to back them up. I didn't know it at the time. I was struck by decision paralysis. I, in fact, never got past this screen. I just still don't know what genre this game is. So, speaking of difficulty, you can overcome this decision paralysis and overloading people by easing players in on a need-to-know basis. What do they actually need to know to make the right decision in that moment? Using Dumb Ways to Survive again as an example, when we were initially developing our first update, which was these difficulty settings, I think we had roughly like 6 different options with all of these different kind of factors, including how frequent weather was, how many aggressive enemies spawned, how many items you drop when you die. Of course, we were developing a casual game for the Netflix platform. We pretty quickly realized this was too much information for people that may not even be familiar with games, let alone kind of standard survival games. And so, easing people in with that need-to-know kind of mindset, instead we took a step back and we just suggested 3 difficulty options: the recommended one, the easier one, and the one with permadeath. And by simplifying this choice and consolidating that down to a simplified choice with easier to understand information, we didn't cause any decision paralysis, importantly, right up front at the start of our game. Of course, you might not be making a casual game. You might be making something with a really wide possibility space. Maybe it's something in the sandbox genre where sort of having a lot of options is integral to the game, being what it is for that audience. Or, something like a fighting game, a MOBA, a hero shooter, where choosing between all these different characters is part of it. One way in these situations that you can reduce that cognitive load and that fatigue is simply just to categorize your options. If we look at Marvel Rivals here, when you boot this game up, you might not be deciding, from like 40 whatever characters, I am choosing this character. First and foremost, you're probably deciding, do I want to play as a tank, as a specialist, as a support? And effectively what the designers have done there is just simplified that choice by splitting it into 2 decisions. It doesn't become overwhelming because you can step by step make those decisions. If you notice that your players are always choosing the same thing, again, you're running user tests and everyone is choosing the same option again and again, I think it's worthwhile to consider, should it be presented as a choice? It may be indicative of kind of a balancing or a UX issue perhaps, but maybe it doesn't need to be a choice at all. You can reduce that cognitive load, of course, if you don't present it as one. In Earthbound, when you are over the level required that you would one-hit an enemy in one shot, the game doesn't waste players' time by loading you into the battle scene and asking you if you want to fight, run, use an item. Instead, it simply skips you straight to the U1 screen. The designers can reasonably predict the outcome, what every player would choose in this situation, so they don't waste your time by presenting it like a choice. Again, when we were developing Dumb Ways to Survive, we had this feature we were developing called the canteen. And the idea behind this was you could go to a body of water, you could fill up 5 sips of this canteen that you could take with you, and then you could drink that whenever you chose to. And on paper, we were stoked. We were like, awesome, we've got this opt-in system where, players have more autonomy about choosing when they get to drink water. Players always drank water at the same time when their thirst meter was empty. We were presenting something as a choice that in fact didn't need to be a choice at all. On top of maybe slightly clunky UX of having to click into it and then click the sip while your thirst meter's running low and you're running out of health, which was a bit stressful, we actually just slowed down gameplay by presenting this as a choice. So what was the solution? We just cut it. In the final game, simply walking up to a body of water refills your thirst. And in fact, we improved the system by taking a choice out altogether. Alrighty, so of course the basis of interactive mediums, right, is that the things you choose when you interact with the system, something changes. The choices those players make need to have a consequence. Something needs to happen. Players become frustrated if they feel like the choices they make don't matter. Simply put, I think you can consider your players almost like an actor on a stage. And the game is their audience. They want to do a little pirouette and have a little round of applause for doing it and to feel special in the choices they make. If you look at this example from Ace Attorney here, I think it's funny in context that none of these options matter in the moment. But if you played a narrative game that was full of only choices like this, you'd very quickly start to question why they're being presented as choices in the first place. Best case, maybe your player becomes complacent and doesn't care what they choose, but worst case, they turn the game off. They become frustrated. So, again, Dumb Ways to Survive, we had this really simple system known as the Scout Handbook, and we had this really cute little feature when we launched the game, just something we threw in kind of last minute, where every single way that you could die in the game filled out this little text prompt just telling you how you died. We didn't want to encourage people to die in the game, of course, so this was just something we added. What we didn't consider is that we had effectively set an expectation of a choice. People might want to opt in to collecting all of these with no meaningful consequence for doing so. And we found out about it pretty quickly. People on the Reddit started inventing playground rumors about how you might be able to unlock these deaths that were never actually accessible because people had already defeated the bosses that would kill you in that way. But instead of going, oh no, people are making a choice we didn't expect, and we need to alter this, we should cut the handbook or something like that, we said, cool, our players want to engage with this. We looked at that qualitative live analysis and said, how do we lean into that? So we added this system called the Dumpedia, which not only did we add a little silly dunce cap as an insult to injury for collecting every death in the game, we said, hey, if our players like ticking boxes and like finishing things in a book, let's make it so everything in the game is a box they can tick. So this system in the end was every single item you could interact with in the game became kind of a category in that level with unique rewards for fulfilling it. And people loved it. And by leaning into a decision we didn't expect people to make in that possibility space, I think we improved the game because of it. Alrighty, so just acknowledging a player, acknowledging that choice, giving them the round of the applause, tipping the hat to them is all they need to feel validated in the decisions they make sometimes. Ultimately, players want to feel seen. The Telltale series famously says, this character will remember that. My understanding of that system is that beyond some key moments that do affect the story, a lot of the time, that is just a text prompt that doesn't actually do anything in the game at all. But importantly, players feel like it does. They feel like they've been acknowledged in the choice they make and that there's a meaningful consequence, despite the fact there might not actually be under the hood. And this is great, right? This is really easy to apply to something like level design where, if you have an area that's kind of out of the way and players manage to get there, put an item, put an enemy, put something. It doesn't have to be, something worthwhile, but they just want to feel like, oh, there was a reason I came here. There was something to acknowledge that I made this choice. So yes, what I'm suggesting is if you are making a 3D game and you have waterfalls, please put treasure chests behind them because people will check every time and you want to acknowledge that decision. So this isn't news to a room full of designers, but of course we know the most compelling decisions are a balance of risk-reward, some kind of trade-off in the decision you're making. If I use this move, maybe I can defeat the boss more quickly, but it's a bit risky, and then if I die, my progress is reset. It's pretty obvious, right? Even more compelling still, though, is if you can shift that consequence or that trade-off based on the context around when they make that decision. So in Blueprints, which is like a puzzle roguelike game if you haven't played it, highly recommended, you have a finite amount of steps in the top left there, and throughout a run, at the start of the run, you might be way more willing to make a decision in drafting a room that costs some of your step count. That exact same decision can be completely recontextualized at the end of a run, right? When you're running low on steps, something that was an obvious choice earlier is now, way higher impact and something you need to sit down and consider a lot harder. It's been completely recontextualized. These are the choices that become strategies in your game, As a player, once you learn this, you might go, okay, I'll always draft rooms that cost my step count towards the start of a run. Suddenly, by shifting that trade-off in when people make that choice in possibility space, you've created, depth of mechanic, you've created a strategy. A kind of a cheat code in making people feel like their choices are meaningful is just leaning into expression. Players, again, if you consider them an actor, they want to be noted for what they're doing. They want to feel special. They want to express themselves and their individual personality through the way they play. Of course, this can be choosing a cosmetic item, right? But it can also be expression through how they choose to play. If you're playing a fighting game and I choose the fast, agile character and my friend always chooses kind of the slow brawler, effectively, what we're doing there is we're communicating the way we like to play that game. We're expressing ourselves through the way that we choose our character. Even something really simple, like giving people the ability to name their characters in an RPG, is enough to have that feeling of autonomy and suddenly have a lot more buy-in in the world by making a really simple choice up front that allows those players to express themselves. Alrighty, so let's discuss how people choose. I'm going to go into some different tips and tricks from psychology and how we can kind of apply those to the games we're making, and we can apply that to our possibility space. So I first want to touch on this concept of first and second order decision making. So a first order decision is essentially this intuitive the kinds of decisions we make tens of thousands of times throughout the day. The way I'm moving my hands right now, I'm not thinking about it, but that's a decision that I'm effectively making, right? It's instinctual, it's intuitive, and this maps really well to things like fighting games, things where maybe muscle memory or previously learned experiences make you make some choices without considering them choices in your head. Alternatively, second order decisions are the ones where you make a choice and you say, and then what? If I make this choice now, what happens next? This maps, of course, really well to your 4X, your grand strategy, RTS games, things like that. I think importantly, the consequences of a second order decision are usually higher. You're sitting down and considering this for a reason. They feel more meaningful, but they do come with that increased cognitive load that we discussed earlier. So as a designer, I think it's up to you to determine if the choices players are making within your game are intended to be a first or a second order decision, and then, user testing that and seeing if the way people are interacting with that game lines up with that expectation. Are they choosing in the way that you expect? The availability heuristic is a really fun kind of shortcut in human psychology, right? What it tells us is that if we can recall something more easily, it must be more noteworthy or more frequent or more important. And most of the time that's true, but it absolutely isn't always the case. The classic example of this is if I get everyone here to consider words for a second that start with the letter K, and then I ask you to consider words where K is the third letter, and then I ask you which are there more of. The availability heuristic probably tells you, oh, there's probably more words that start with K because I can recall them more easily. But in fact, that's not true. There are far more words where K is the third letter. Again, this maps really well to games, right? If a player encounters a really rare loot drop, 1% chance or something, they're actually probably more inclined to tell their friends that, no, it's easier than you think. That's actually really common. It happened to me, therefore, it must be something that happens frequently. Something like Ratchet & Clank 2016, somewhat controversially online, had this mechanic where every time you come to a new planet, the vendor says, hey, come and buy this new weapon. Implementation aside, I think it's clear what the designers were fixing here was that people were probably sticking to the guns they knew because it was more available to them, and they needed to be reminded that there were other options they can engage with. If anyone in the room is from a marketing background, you'll be very familiar with the concept of anchor points. Daniel Kahneman calls this the adjustment heuristic, or basically, adjusting the decision you make based on the options that are presented to you. So if I show you the small popcorn for $3.99 and the large popcorn for $6.49, you might start thinking about the price and then sort of wondering how much more popcorn is in a large and then saying, I don't actually even want to eat that much popcorn. But if you add an anchor point to this and you add this medium popcorn for $5.99, suddenly the decision becomes really easy. It's only 50 more cents and I get so much more popcorn. The designer of this choice never actually intended anyone to really choose the medium popcorn. It only exists as an option to make people more likely to choose the large. And again, this completely can map onto games, right? So in Candy Critters, obviously any game, if you have sort of microtransactions, you'll probably find this is something that they include, right? We include it, of course, so when you start looking at maybe the medium option here, you're more inclined to do some math and go, oh, better bang for my buck if I do the large option. And again, by having that anchor point, you've been encouraged to make a different decision. But it's not just purchasing, right? If we look at Dumb Ways to Survive and the pickaxes in that game, your iron pickaxe is kind of your anchor point option. It's your middle of the road, clearly better than the handmade pickaxe. The golden pickaxe, on the other hand, is much stronger, but breaks more quickly. Now, as designers, we don't really mind in this game if our players opted for the gold or the iron pickaxe more often, but by having the iron pickaxe be this kind of middle-of-the-road option, we have made that decision, easier for the player in the way they want to express themselves and the way they choose to play. So, a funny little quirk of our human psychology is that negative feedback is more impactful to us than positive feedback. If you take $100 away from someone, they react more negatively than someone reacts positively if you give them $100. This means that when you're balancing those trade-offs and that risk-reward we discussed earlier, you probably should consider making sure that the risk is actually less impactful than the reward is great, because people will overemphasize how much that risk affects them. A really fun example of this, if you're not familiar with it, is the rested XP system in World of Warcraft. Essentially, the designers wanted to encourage certain behavior, certain choices. They didn't want people playing for more than 2 hours a day. So they invented this system where after 2 hours, your XP earned went down to 50%, and people hated it. So what they did, instead of scrapping it or doing a different system, they simply reframed how they presented it. instead of a penalty, suddenly they presented it as a 200% bonus XP, and then after 2 hours, it went down to 100. The numbers never actually changed, but by reframing it as not a negative and not a punishment, people suddenly understood and they got the desired behavior without negatively impacting the player base. So, this slide sounds really sinister out of context, but if we know that negative emotions impact people and encourage them to make certain decisions, we know that the fear of negative impact can motivate certain decisions. Again, it sounds kind of sinister, but this is exactly the reason why when you beat a long RPG, you still have an inventory full of potions or cheese wheels or something. It's because the potential to lose that opportunity actually weighs you down more than the benefit of just using the healing item in the moment. You're so afraid to lose that opportunity that you don't make a choice at all. If we look at Candy Critters, this example here, we have this system called the Pet Chumplet, which is kind of an opt-in system where if you stay engaged with it, this little critter can help you through the level. If you disengage from it, however, rather than straight up just taking it away from the player for not engaging, we present an option where we say, last chance, you're gonna lose this unless you engage right now. And by encouraging that sort of fear of loss, we encourage more people to make this decision in the moment. This is a really powerful tool, right? But of course, use it sparingly. You don't want to be punishing your players all the time and threatening them with constantly losing things. Alrighty, I want to talk for a second about dominant strategy. I'm sure we're all familiar with this concept of, if one choice that you can make in a possibility space kind of outweighs all the other choices in the game, players are way more likely to choose that option every time as the easy option. When I was first getting into game design, I kind of had this idea of dominant strategy as a bit of a dirty word and something you should avoid, You should never be one option that clearly outweighs itself against all the other ones. But I think it's important to note that dominant strategy isn't inherently bad, right? Degenerate strategy, or degenerate dominant strategy, is something like, again, referencing Tears of the Kingdom. It has a really robust kind of crafting, building mechanic, but the moment you realize that the cheapest thing you can build and the easiest thing is this hover bike and you can just fly over every decision in the game, suddenly I was doing that every time. But when I played something like Dark Souls and I found the Black Knight sword really early, which if you can see there is like 220 attack compared to everything around it, greatly eclipsed everything around it. The dominant strategy for me for that whole game, I stuck to the Black Knight sword for the whole game. But why don't I consider that degenerate? Because the most engaging parts of Dark Souls weren't undermined by using this dominant strategy. I still had to get good, I still had to learn my way around the bosses, I still had plenty of items to explore and find. So the important thing I want to note here is that it could be really easy to look at a dominant strategy in your game when players are interacting with it for the first time and say, oh no, everyone's sticking to that one option, I'm going to have to nerf that and sort of balance everything out equally. But, as long as it's the most engaging part of the game, let people do it. If it's fun, why not? That's what they're there for, right? Awesome. So let's talk through some core takeaways together. So I think I want to emphasize again, possibility space is a useful design tool at every stage of production. I think it's something that, every couple of months while you're developing a game, you should take a step back and just analyze those decisions as decisions. What are people choosing to do within your game? By using clear visual language, leaning on your genre conventions and being consistent in the choices in a safe environment, you can teach people what those options are. Less is more. Really consider, the options you're presenting. Categorize them or cut options that maybe don't need to be options altogether. You want to avoid that decision paralysis. Just simply acknowledging a player's decisions, utilizing trade-off and expression, you can make the decisions they make feel more meaningful. And of course, we already know this, but players won't always choose exactly what you expect. Consider these different psychological motivators in terms of when you're crafting these decisions. How do people think? Is it the way you expect? So some further reading. I referenced it before, but Sid Meier, again, has a GDC talk. It's on YouTube about exactly this topic through the lens of civilization. Really recommend it if you haven't seen it already. The book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, he invented a few of those heuristics we talked before about. This is all about that first and second order decision making that we discussed. And the book The Paradox of Choice by Barry Schwartz is about exactly that. This kind of looks at the everyday life that we live right now through the lens of, why are we becoming more depressed despite having more options? It's a bit of a bleak read, but, I think it's really enlightening. And that's it. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think... I probably talked a bit fast. We're a little bit under time. I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions, if I'm not mistaken. So I've got a roaming mic up here. Sorry, I have not been looking at the app. If people have been asking questions in the app, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll just do it through this way. Also, if you like hearing me yap about game design, I have a TikTok and a YouTube channel. I've been making shorts about it. At Hey It's Tutti, feel free to check it out. Thanks. Yeah, any questions? Hand up there.
Thank you for the talk.
Of course.
I've heard about that decision needs to be meaningful in multi-dimensional way. I'll give an example. Let's say you have a reward, restore your health or restore your mana, and I've been told it's not really good choice because it's you don't need to think. If you have low on health, I'll restore health. If I'm low on mana, I'll restore mana. Instead, you should offer restore health or get assigned a new quest, something that's kind of not to do with each other. Is there a heuristic on creating this kind of? Is there like a concept here that I'm trying?
Yeah, no, yeah. So you're asking like if a choice is kind of too obvious in that moment because they're always going to choose, to refill their mana if their mana is low, or their health if their health is low. Is that kind of a weak choice or not something? Is that correct in what you're asking?
Yeah, and how do you create a strong choice?
So I think you could approach it two different ways. Again, if you look at that kind of first order decision making. Is it sort of just mechanically fun in itself to pick that option? Is it something that you have a limited time, or it's kind of, the way you select that option is just fun in itself? Maybe that makes it a meaningful choice. Or, again, you could look at like the trade-offs, right? Like if you choose mana now, maybe you can't choose it again later. Maybe it's on a cooldown. I think it depends on what you're trying to craft, of course, but there's definitely ways you can kind of look to those decisions and make them more meaningful.
Hello.
Hi.
Good talk, by the way. Well
Thank
presented.
you. Appreciate it.
I just had a question regarding how did you decide between listening to the players in Dumb Ways to Survive and the Death Tracker interaction versus cutting the interaction for throwing objects in free-for-all, Dumb Ways free-for-all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it kind of depended on, how engaged people were and whether or not they were kind of pointing at it as a frustration versus like the Death Tracker in Dumb Ways to Survive. People weren't frustrated because they didn't yet know that it was impossible. So we were like, oh, people are really opting to do that more and more. If we had sort of taken that same approach in free-for-all with letting people throw everything, I feel like we would have broadened our possibility space too much, and suddenly you've got all these choices that don't have meaningful consequences. If we let people pick up the bucket and the fishing rod and things, maybe that adds more autonomy, but that didn't actually have any payoff in the game. So by leaning into the Death Tracker, we knew, okay, we have to add some meaningful consequences. Yeah, I mean, the other thing always, right, is that tight production schedules, you can't always make something meaningful if you don't have the time to do so. So yeah.
Cool, thank you.
No worries. Looks like there's one at the back there.
Making you run around. So I guess as a designer, you're talking about a lot of these I can see it in the context of the choice that's in front of the player, maybe the specific feature that you're working on. I'm curious when you're thinking about the whole game and the vision that you're making and the space of that, do you have a process or a way where you're kind of thinking through the broader possibility spaces across the whole game, or do you kind of approach it as you're designing and case by case, like you test and you see there's an issue?
Yeah, so just so I'll clarify that. So you're saying like at the start of a game, at the inception, kind of, are you considering how broad the possibility space should be from the jump, or are you kind of figuring that out moment to moment?
Yeah, both. And so when you, like, say if you're at the start of the game looking at your game vision, are you trying to plan with the possibility space in mind and how broad you want it to be, or do you approach that case by case as you design?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I hate to give the cop-out answer. I think a little bit of both, right? I think at the start, obviously, again, most of the time we're developing something within an existing genre or, with a target audience in mind. So I think by looking at kind of comparison games, of course, or like what exists within that genre or that audience engages with, that can really help you define that possibility space up front. But then, yeah, moment to moment is definitely the emphasis for me of like user testing, seeing if your target audience especially is making the decisions you expect in those moments and are engaging with that and find those choices meaningful. So yeah, sorry, both is my answer, but definitely. Cool. There's a few around.
Hi. So Dark Souls is a really interesting choice because you could argue that it's particularly obtuse and lacking clarity and also quite punitive. So it seems almost the opposite of many of the things we're talking about here or leveraging those. What do you think in particular makes it successful as a title?
I think Dark Souls has the benefit of sort of, I guess it's a hard one. I think it really comes down to target audience, right? Again, like I want to emphasize a lot of the things I'm coming from a background of making a lot of mobile and a lot of casual games where maybe I kind of tend to overemphasize what is a choice. But that discovery of figuring out what is a choice you can make is also really impactful. Doing something you didn't expect to be a choice can really resonate with certain players. I think that's probably why Dark Souls is so controversial, right? Because the people that get it, they get past that moment and they go, oh, this is way cooler than I thought. I can do all these things. But to a certain different audience, it becomes, as you said, really obtuse. So yeah, I think it really depends on kind of who you're trying to target. And I think that's, again, where I'd suggest if you were making a game like Dark Souls, you'd look at sort of the games in the space. Maybe there's room for, something like Another Crab's Treasure, if you played that right, was Dark Souls with a bunch of difficulty options that allowed players to sort of approach it at their own pace. There's a gun that you can one-shot any boss in the game. That was their niche. That was the thing. They looked at that game and said, okay, we can broaden that audience by broadening that possibility space.
Hey, thank you
Hi.
for the talk.
No worries.
So you talked a little bit fairly early on about teaching players about what the possibility space was through consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a process through which you figure out whether that teaching method is going to be through like positive or negative reinforcement or positive or negative punishment?
I wouldn't say I have a process necessarily for exactly that. I think that's, again, I'm just going to emphasize user testing, right? You'll write those hypotheses and you'll say, cool, I think in this moment, my players are going to feel that they'll make this choice more often because they don't want that negative impact, right? And then you can watch people play and you can measure against that hypothesis and just see if that's correct. I would argue, yeah, again, it kind of depends on if you want the game to feel like a punishing experience, but obviously, with everything I discussed about negative feedback, I would suggest that leaning too far on the punishing side can obviously alienate certain player bases. So no process per se, but that's a good question. One more over here.
Hey, thanks for the talk. You talked a lot about designing a certain choice and then having your players like subvert the expectation of what you thought they were going to do, and then you've pivoted on that front. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with the concept of desire pathing?
I'm not.
Wait to see where people walk before you build the
Oh,
paved
right,
path.
yes, of course, yep.
Is there ever a use case that you could see, depending upon how your playtesting schedule goes, for deliberately not presenting an obvious choice to see what your players prefer to do and then designing around that afterwards?
So not sure I understand, sorry. So you're saying like maybe not giving them, making it not obvious that the choice is there and seeing if they still sort of fall into that behavior, or?
I guess that's a way to interpret it. Yep.
Yeah, sometimes. I think, obviously when you're developing a game, we've probably all learned that the fatui and the tutorial and stuff is something that has to come at the end because the game's changed so much. There's no point doing a tutorial at the start. So I think it's always effective to basically user test without the tutorial, and in that same way be like, are people making these decisions? Is it obvious without, you know, greater context, without text pop-ups, without a character, a cutscene explaining what to do? Yeah, I hope that sort of answers your question. Cool. Any more? Just at the front here? I think this might be the last one, but I'll be at the little design networking thing at 12 o'clock if anyone does want to talk to me.
Hello.
Hi.
Sometimes when I'm making choices in video games, I have to choose between what I think is the best decision and self-expression, specifically in games like, I suppose, Dark Souls, where you're building out how you want to play through the game. If I look online and I see like a specific weapon is the best weapon to be using, I'll be choosing that weapon instead of what I think might be cooler or might be more resonant to how I would like to play. How would I design around that?
That specific, so you're asking, you know, if it comes to expression or maybe like a dominant strategy, like how would you design around, you know, what is the correct choice for players? I immediately jump to like cosmetic slots, obviously in games with cosmetic slots where I can look how I want and have the coolest, strongest stuff is a solution to that, specifically in terms of that expression. But I think if it's more around like the play style kind of version, again, you just have to make sure that that dominant strategy doesn't undermine what is the most engaging in the game. So again, just using the weapon as an example, if it was like, I don't know, a big hammer that just clicked one button and one hit everything, maybe that's not as engaging as the alternative. So maybe you don't want that to be the strongest weapon in the game. I think just making sure that, you know, through balancing that the things that are dominant are kind of the more fun parts of the game. No worries. Awesome. Thank you again so much. This is my first time doing anything like this, so I hope you enjoyed it.